For more than 30 years, a group of scientists worked on one of the biggest questions a human being can ask. Are the races we talk about every day actually real at the level of biology? To answer this, they did not rely on guesswork or old assumptions. They traveled to some of the most remote corners of the planet and collected DNA samples from real people. They went to small villages hidden inside the Amazon rainforest. They visited nomadic herders moving across the open plains of Mongolia. They reached tiny island communities scattered across the Pacific Ocean, and they climbed into mountain villages tucked deep inside the Himalayas. Their goal was simple to describe, but incredibly hard to achieve. Build the largest and most complete map of human genetic diversity that has ever existed, then let the data speak for itself. When the results finally came in, they did not just add a small detail to what we already knew, they rewrote it. Some of the researchers who first saw the numbers thought there had to be a mistake somewhere, because nothing matched the old assumptions about race, ancestry, and identity. But there was no mistake. The equipment was fine, the science was solid. What they were looking at was simply a version of human history that nobody had properly understood before. If topics like this interest you, stick around, because this channel is all about breaking down big scientific discoveries in a way that actually makes sense. Now let's get into exactly what this research found. The project that made all of this possible began in the early 1990s. From the very start, it was controversial. The idea was to gather genetic material from indigenous communities around the world before rapid globalization changed or erased their populations forever. Some people criticized the whole idea, saying it was risky or even disrespectful to treat human communities like specimens to be cataloged. Others argued that this information was too important to lose, and that understanding our shared genetic story mattered more than the discomfort of collecting it. Whatever side people took, almost everyone agreed on one point. If this project succeeded, it would change the conversation about human variation forever. In the end, researchers gathered genetic samples from more than 1,000 individuals, representing over 50 different population groups, spread across 7 major regions of the world, including Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. Every single sample went through advanced sequencing machines capable of reading millions of tiny genetic letters in a short amount of time. The raw information that came out of this process was staggering. It filled entire banks of servers with more data than anyone could look through by hand. Powerful computer systems were needed just to organize it, let alone analyze it. Once the numbers started coming back, one thing became obvious almost immediately. The genetic gap between groups that people usually call different races was far smaller than anybody expected. Picture someone born and raised in Beijing standing next to someone born and raised in Stockholm. On the outside, they can look almost nothing alike. Different skin color, different eye shape, different hair texture, different facial structure. But when scientists compared their actual DNA, something surprising showed up. These two people share about 99.9% of their genetic code. Only a tiny sliver of difference, around 0.1%, separates them. And it was inside that tiny sliver that the real story was hiding. As researchers dug deeper into that small fraction, they discovered that the traditional idea of separate races has almost no real foundation in genetics. In fact, some individuals from East Africa turned out to share more genetic similarities with people from Southern Europe than with other groups from West Africa. In another surprising case, a population living deep in the Amazon carried certain genetic markers that closely resembled markers found among people in Papua New Guinea, a place thousands of miles away on the other side of the planet. The clean, simple boxes we like to draw around race simply do not exist once you look at the actual genetic code. But the biggest surprise of all was still waiting to be revealed. Scientists discovered that the highest level of genetic diversity on the entire planet is found within the African continent itself, not between continents, and not between the groups we typically label as different races. Two people living in neighboring villages in Ethiopia can, in some cases, be more genetically different from each other than a random person from Ethiopia is from a random person in Norway. At first, this sounds impossible, but once you understand the timeline of human history, it starts to make complete sense. Modern humans first appeared in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For an enormous stretch of that time, human populations stayed on the African continent. Groups mixed together, separated again, adapted to new environments, and built up an incredible amount of genetic variety over hundreds of thousands of years. Everything that later spread across the rest of the world essentially came from a smaller slice of that original African diversity. When small groups of people eventually began migrating out of Africa, somewhere around 70,000 years ago, they only carried a portion of the total genetic variation that already existed back home. Scientists call this pattern the founder effect. A small group leaving a much larger population can never fully represent everything that population contained. They take a sample with them, and that sample becomes the genetic starting point for every new population they eventually create. Here is a simple way to picture it. Imagine a large bag filled with 100 marbles of different colors, and that bag represents the full genetic diversity found in Africa. Now imagine reaching in and grabbing only 15 of those marbles to place into a brand new empty bag. That second bag represents the genetic diversity that traveled out of Africa. Even if those 15 marbles eventually get split apart, spread out across Europe, Asia, and beyond, they can never contain more variety than what already existed in the original bag of 100. This exact pattern showed up again and again as scientists traced different migration routes around the world. The further a population moved away from Africa, the less internal genetic diversity it carried. European populations show less variety than populations from the Middle East. East Asian populations show less variety than populations from Central Asia, and indigenous populations of the Americas, who traveled the farthest and were among the last groups to migrate, carrying their ancestors across an ancient land bridge, ended up with the least amount of internal genetic diversity of any region studied. But the surprises did not stop with the topic of diversity. Something even more unexpected showed up when scientists zoomed in on specific genes. The genes responsible for the physical features we usually associate with race, things like skin tone, hair texture, and facial structure, make up an incredibly small portion of the human genome, well under 1% of our total genetic material. These are exactly the traits that history has used to sort people into categories, and tragically, the same traits that have been used to justify centuries of discrimination, forced labor, and violence, and yet, from a purely genetic standpoint, they represent almost nothing. What makes this even stranger is how recently these traits actually appeared. The genetic mutation responsible for lighter skin tones in European populations only showed up around 8,000 years ago. Blue eyes are even newer, emerging somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, and interestingly, researchers traced this trait back to a single shared ancestor who lived near the Black Sea region. Meanwhile, the distinctive eye shape common in East Asian populations developed through a completely separate genetic path, unrelated to anything happening in Europe at the time. In the grand timeline of human existence, these outward physical traits are incredibly young adaptations, tiny surface level changes compared to the vast history of our species. Meanwhile, the genetic traits we cannot see with our eyes turn out to be far more complicated and far more important. Things like disease resistance, how efficiently the body processes food and energy, how the brain develops, and how the immune system responds to threats all involve a huge amount of genetic complexity. These traits show massive variation inside every single population group on Earth, not just between different groups. In other words, you cannot look at someone's physical appearance and predict their intelligence, their physical ability, or their health risks. The genes controlling those things are scattered randomly across every human population, with no connection to skin color or facial features whatsoever. The research also revealed something else that challenges a lot of popular assumptions about ancestry. Most people on Earth carry genetic ancestry that comes from more than one geographic region, even if they identify strongly with just one culture or nationality. Someone who identifies as Chinese might carry genetic markers connected to Central Asian populations. Someone who identifies as European might have traces of Middle Eastern ancestry hidden in their DNA. Someone from the Caribbean will very often carry a combination of African, European, and indigenous American ancestry all mixed together. This kind of genetic blending is not some new side effect of modern travel or globalization. It has been happening throughout the entire span of human history, anytime different populations came into contact with one another. Studies using ancient DNA samples found that people living in Europe today typically descend from at least 3 separate ancestral groups: early farming communities, older hunter-gatherer populations, and herding groups that migrated in from the Eurasian steppe region. None of these ancestral groups were pure or isolated to begin with. Each one was already a mixture created from even earlier populations. This exact same pattern shows up almost everywhere researchers looked. East Asian populations carry genetic evidence of multiple waves of migration layered on top of each other. Pacific Island populations appear to descend from at least 2 separate waves of settlement, blending seafaring Austronesian groups with earlier indigenous communities. Even populations that seem completely isolated on the surface usually show signs of genetic exchange with neighboring groups, stretching back thousands of years. Put simply, the data completely destroys the idea of racial purity. There has never been a truly pure or fully isolated human population. Given enough time and enough contact, mixing happens. The idea that clean, permanent genetic lines exist between racial groups simply falls apart once you look at the actual genome. So if race is not something written into our DNA, why do people from different parts of the world look so different from one another? The answer comes down to environmental adaptation. As human populations spread out across the globe, they encountered dramatically different climates, altitudes, sunlight levels, and disease environments. Natural selection favored whatever physical traits helped a population survive and reproduce successfully in their specific local environment, Darker skin offered protection against intense sun exposure near the equator. Lighter skin allowed for better vitamin D production in northern regions with weaker sunlight. The distinctive eye shape found in many East Asian populations may have offered protection against cold winds and bright glare reflecting off snow. Interestingly, many of these adaptations developed completely independently in different parts of the world, a process scientists call convergent evolution. For example, populations in southern India and Aboriginal populations in Australia both evolved dark skin tones, despite being genetically distinct from one another and living on opposite sides of the planet. Their skin color evolved along separate genetic pathways, but arrived at a similar outward result because both groups were living in regions with intense sun exposure. This is a similar concept to why dolphins and sharks both evolved streamlined, fin-covered bodies, even though one is a mammal and the other is a fish. Different starting points, similar environmental pressure, and a similar final solution. Some traits reveal this pattern even more clearly because they completely ignore the boundaries we usually draw around race. Take the ability to digest milk sugar into adulthood. This trait shows up in populations that historically raised dairy animals, including certain groups in Northern Europe, East African herding communities, and some populations in Central Asia. Yet, it is largely absent in most East Asian populations, and in many African groups as well, even ones located fairly close to populations that do carry the trait. This tells us the trait spread based on cultural practices, specifically whether a group relied on dairy farming, not based on any racial category. High-altitude adaptation tells a similar story. Populations living in Tibet develop genetic changes that allow their bodies to use oxygen more efficiently at extreme elevation. Populations living in the Andes Mountains of South America developed a completely different set of genetic adaptations, yet ended up achieving a very similar outcome, the ability to survive and function, at altitudes that would cause serious health problems for people from lowland regions. Both groups solved the same survival challenge, but through entirely separate genetic routes, because each population adapted independently to a shared environmental pressure. There was one more major discovery buried in the data, and at first researchers found it a little confusing to explain. Certain disease-related genetic traits really do appear more often in specific geographic populations. Sickle cell trait shows up more frequently in people with West African ancestry. Tay-Sachs disease appears at higher rates among people of Ashkenazi Jewish background. Cystic fibrosis is more common among people of European ancestry. At first glance, this seems to support the old idea that race does carry some genetic meaning after all. But a closer look told a very different story. These disease-related genetic variants did not spread because of race as a category. They spread because they offered a survival advantage against a specific local threat. The sickle cell trait, for example, provides real protection against malaria, which was historically widespread across parts of West Africa. Carrying just one copy of this gene offered resistance to malaria without causing full-blown sickle cell disease. Natural selection favored this trait heavily in regions where malaria posed a constant danger, regardless of what racial label we might apply to the people living there today. This same explanation applies to other disease clusters tied to specific geographic regions. They are not proof of deep genetic separation between races. They are proof of local evolutionary responses to specific environmental threats. In fact, a person from West Africa and a person from a historically malaria-affected part of southern Europe might both carry genetic resistance to malaria, despite being placed into completely different racial categories. Meanwhile, two people considered part of the same racial group could carry very different disease risks if their ancestors came from regions with different environmental pressures. This is exactly why using race as a stand-in for genetic risk inside modern medicine can be dangerous and misleading. Individual genetic testing gives a far more accurate picture of a person's health risks than any racial category ever could. So where did the idea of separate human races actually come from, if not from biology? The concept of distinct races took shape mainly during the 1700s and 1800s, when European scientists of that era tried to sort human beings into categories the same way they sorted plants and animals. They built rigid hierarchies based on physical appearance and cultural customs, and they ranked entire groups of people as supposedly superior or inferior to one another. These classifications were then used to justify colonization, forced labor, and violence against entire populations. The scientists behind these ideas claimed they were simply following objective observation, but in reality, their conclusions were shaped heavily by the biases and power structures of their era. They observed differences in technology, culture, and social organization between populations, and rather than recognizing those differences as the result of history, environment, and circumstance, they mistakenly treated them as permanent proof of inherited biological inferiority. Temporary cultural and historical differences were turned into fixed, supposedly scientific racial categories. Modern genetics has dismantled that entire framework. The physical traits that early race science used to build its hierarchies show no connection at all to intelligence, morality, or any measure of human worth. The small genetic differences that really do exist between populations are either neutral or simply useful adaptations to local environments. None of it supports ranking any group of people as superior or inferior to another. Perhaps the most powerful part of this entire body of research is not what scientists found, but what they never found at all. There was no genetic evidence to justify strict borders between peoples. There was no genetic support for the idea of racial nationalism. There was no evidence that any single population is somehow more advanced or more fully human than another. Instead, what emerged from all of this genetic evidence was a picture of one single species, with a shared and surprisingly recent common origin, and a genetic history that makes our surface-level differences look small in comparison to everything we share. According to this genetic research, the most recent common ancestor shared by every person alive today lived only around 3,000 years ago. That means if you traced your family tree back roughly 120 generations, you would land on a single individual connected to every other human being currently alive on Earth. Your personal family history and the family history of someone living on the opposite side of the planet actually meet at a surprisingly recent point in time. Go back a bit further, to roughly 7,000 years ago, and something even more remarkable becomes true. Every person alive on Earth today shares the exact same complete set of ancestors from that time period. Anyone alive back then who has any surviving descendants today is, in fact, an ancestor to every single one of the roughly 8 billion people alive on the planet right now. Ancient communities living in Mesopotamia, early farming settlements along the Yellow River, hunter-gatherer groups in southern Africa, if any of them have descendants alive today, then you are one of those descendants. So is literally everyone else on the planet. This single fact completely destroys the idea of a pure, unbroken ancestral bloodline. Nobody descends from just one isolated ancestral group. Every person alive today descends from all of them at once. Human ancestry is not a straight line leading back to one single origin point. It is a massive, interconnected web that touches the entire human family tree. If you feel a stronger cultural connection to one ancestral group over another, that connection comes from culture and upbringing, not from anything written into your DNA. The genetic data also revealed some completely unexpected connections between populations separated by enormous distances. Some indigenous populations in the Americas carry genetic markers that closely match populations from Siberia, which lines up with what we know about ancient migration across a land bridge connecting the two continents. But surprisingly, some of these same populations also carry small traces of ancient genetic material connected to Aboriginal Australians and populations from Papua New Guinea. How exactly genetic material connected to Oceania ended up in the Americas thousands of years ago is still being pieced together by researchers today. What is clear, though, is that human migration across the planet was far more complicated and interconnected than a simple straight line moving out of Africa. European populations reveal a similarly complex story. Ancient DNA, recovered from skeletal remains, shows that people living in Europe today are not direct descendants of the very first hunter-gatherer groups who originally settled the continent. Those early populations were largely replaced by incoming farming communities that arrived from Anatolia roughly 9,000 years ago. Later, those farming populations were partially replaced again by herding groups migrating in from the steppe region around 5,000 years ago. In other words, modern Europeans are a genetic blend created from at least 3 distinct waves of population movement, and none of those earlier groups had any concept of a shared European identity, because that cultural identity simply did not exist yet at the time. East Asian genetic history tells a similarly layered story. The Han Chinese population, often treated in casual conversation as one single uniform group, actually formed through the gradual merging of northern and southern populations over thousands of years of expansion and cultural unification. The genetic diversity found within China alone rivals the genetic diversity found across the entire European continent. Treating over 1 billion people as one single uniform racial category completely ignores the enormous genetic variation hidden underneath surface-level similarities. Taken all together, this global comparison of human DNA quietly took apart every scientific argument that has ever been used to support the idea of racial superiority or separation. It showed that human genetic variation flows in a continuous pattern rather than fitting neatly into fixed categories. It showed that populations blend gradually into one another without any clear dividing lines. It confirmed that the genetic differences found within any single so-called racial group are typically larger than the average genetic difference between separate groups. Most importantly, this research backs up something that anthropologists and evolutionary biologists have been saying for a very long time. Race, as we commonly define it, is a social construct, not a biological reality. The categories humans created to divide ourselves do not line up with the actual patterns found in our DNA. Race was invented to justify social hierarchies, and over time, people convinced themselves that those hierarchies reflected some kind of natural, built-in biological division. The genetic evidence makes it clear that they never did. None of this means that racism has not caused real, lasting harm. Social categories built around race have shaped access to resources, opportunities, education, and power for centuries, and continue to do so today. The everyday lived experience of people placed into different racial categories can be extremely different, even though the biological basis for those categories does not actually exist. Understanding that race is not rooted in genetics does not erase or minimize the very real social and economic effects that racism has caused throughout history. But it does mean that we can no longer hide behind the idea of natural, built-in biological differences to explain inequality. There is no genetic reason why one group should hold more power than another. There is no DNA-based justification for unequal access to resources or opportunity. The disparities we see today in wealth, health, education, and opportunity are the result of historical decisions and ongoing social systems, not some unavoidable outcome written into our genetic code. The scientists who compared DNA samples from every corner of the Earth handed us something incredibly valuable, a powerful evidence-based tool to push back against centuries of false scientific claims about race. What they proved is that underneath our outward differences, human beings are far more alike than most of us ever realized. Human diversity, when you really look closely at it, is not a ladder with some groups ranked above others. It is a wide connected spectrum shaped by migration, adaptation, and time. It confirms that every person on this planet belongs to one single human family, connected by a shared and surprisingly recent history. This discovery did more than surprise the scientific community. It reshaped our entire understanding of what it actually means to be human, and it gave all of us solid evidence to finally move beyond the harmful and outdated idea of biological race. What we choose to do with that evidence now is entirely up to us.